Welcome to Excellence Talks, and welcome again, John Magee, founder at contrastingcultures.com, helping global companies with cross-border collaboration. John is American, having studied, lived, and worked in Germany for almost 30 years, and the most authentic bicultural person that I've ever met.
Christian, thank you very much for the invitation. 30 years, it's a long time, isn't it?
Yeah. It is, in fact. John, for many people, the concept of cultural differences is a bit unclear, theoretical, academic. Can you please give us a concrete example of a cultural difference in the Germany-USA space?
One example? Just one?
Please, just one.
I could give you 50, but my guess is you don't want to hear 50, Christian. I understand it when people think that this intercultural stuff sounds a little bit intellectual and esoteric and touchy-feely, especially when people like you and I are consulting very sophisticated companies doing very sophisticated things with a lot of engineers and a lot of scientists, people crunching numbers. But let me give you just one example in the Germany-USA space. As you know, that's my area of expertise, but it's good to remind your listeners that these cultural differences exist no matter what the cultural combination is in cross-border teams. Germany-USA happens to be my experience and my expertise, but this is true for any combination of cultures operating in a cross-border team. So let's take one simple, basic, but very clear difference between Germans and Americans, a difference that has very strong influence on their ability to collaborate. And that has to do with communication. And I'll give it to you in a really simplified, black and white, almost freeze-dried form. Germans are direct in their communication. They believe that you should say what you mean and mean what you say. Germans believe that you should use clear language, unambiguous. You shouldn't use euphemisms. You should avoid figures of speech. You should really cut to the core of whatever it is you want to communicate. And the Germans also separate more strongly than Americans do between person and subject. So it's okay for Germans in communication. They consider it actually to be professional and competent and effective to be quite direct in their communication. Okay, so the Germans are direct. The Americans, despite what people see in Hollywood films and television series, are actually far more indirect than most people think. And they're certainly more indirect than Germans. Americans don't always say what they mean, and they don't necessarily mean what they say. And depending on the situation and on the topic and who's in the meeting or in the call, Americans can be quite indirect. They can use euphemisms, they can use figures of speech, they can circumnavigate, which is kind of a complicated term. They can dance around a topic if they feel that it's too sensitive. And if you look at our three questions from the previous video, well, the difference is Germans are direct, Americans are less direct. Okay, good. What's the impact on collaboration? German directness can be quite frightening for Americans. It can scare them off, it can intimidate them, it can make them quiet. American indirectness can be problematical for Germans because Germans aren't native speakers in English. They're great at English, but they're never native speakers. So a lot of the nuances and the indirectness of American communication is difficult for Germans to decipher, to understand. So it makes the communication that much more difficult. The third question is, well, then how do you deal with this cultural difference? Well, it's pretty straightforward. I asked the Germans to try to be a little bit direct, a little bit softer in their language. And I asked the Americans to have maybe a little bit of a thicker skin and be a little bit more direct and not take things so personally. So once you understand the difference and you understand the impact of the difference on collaboration, it's not all that difficult to make slight modifications to your own behavior in order to make the collaboration work. And this is not asking anybody to give up their culture. So that's a basic difference, but it's an important one. The Germans are direct in their communication. The Americans are more indirect.
Well, that is indeed a clear difference, John. And you took us through the three questions again. Thank you. What impact do such cultural differences have on collaboration then?
It's sad, and it's why I'm so passionate in my work. I want Americans and Germans to understand each other. I've been living in your culture, Christian, for 30 years, and my intention was to learn your language, to study the history of your country, to get deeply embedded in the country. I didn't think it would be 3 decades, but it's become 3 decades, and it's been 3 great decades. So this is a very personal matter, and when Germans and Americans or any cultures don't understand each other from the get-go in their collaboration will always be suboptimal. It can't be any other way. And so the problem is, as I said before, German directness can scare Americans. It can make Americans feel uncomfortable with Germans. And that leads to Americans avoiding interaction with their German colleagues. Well, that's not good for collaboration. And on the flip side, the American indirectness and the usage of euphemisms and being hyper politically correct is just frustrating for the Germans. It demands a lot of energy and brain power to decipher and interpret what Americans are saying and what they're not saying and why. It's exhausting anyway to operate great in a foreign language. But if you add this cultural layer to it, it just becomes very debilitating and very tiring for Germans, which leads many of them to say, gee, if we could find ways to avoid collaborating with our American colleagues, let's do it. It's just too difficult, problematical. And that's the opposite of what we want in cross-border teams.
Can we even assume, John, that the impact affects the bottom line?
Oh, sure. This is a problem in modern day business. As you know, with your deep expertise in process harmonization and excellence, a lot of companies believe that success factors are only important if you can measure them, if you can quantify them. And that's true in many areas, but in most areas, it's not true. If we're honest with ourselves, the most complex success factors in global companies are wrapped around human beings and their interaction. It's cross-border collaboration. So if you have clear differences between cultures, and those differences are in foundational areas, and those differences are not understood, and therefore they cause frustration, miscommunication, irritation within cross-border teams, then those cross-border teams, their performance will be suboptimal. Anybody who's responsible for a cross-border team knows exactly what the impact is on the bottom line if their teams aren't performing well together. That's not the job of a consultant for you or for me to tell them. Our job is to explain to them where the cultural differences are and where the impact is. If they know their business, then they know their teams. They can calculate or estimate fairly accurately what the negative impact will be on the performance on the team and therefore on the bottom line. So when we talk about cultural differences and we talk about the bottom line, we're talking about a direct and immediate and constant impact on the bottom line. Now, these things cannot be calculated the way you would calculate how a factory produces widgets or pumps out cars, but global companies don't have to have exact cause and effect calculation. They have to have a ballpark or estimation of the negative impact when a cross-border team working on a new product is not getting along with each other. So, and I think most sophisticated people in global companies have figured that out, and they're beginning to pay very close attention to culture and cultural differences and the impact on overall performance of cross-border teams.
John, thank you again. Highly appreciate it.
Enjoyed it very much, Christian. Thanks go to you.